Sansa Stark arrived in King's Landing with her family on a bright morning that disguised every menace lurking beneath the surface. The capital was so alive with color and noise that it overwhelmed her senses from the first instant she glimpsed its walls. She had gazed out from the carriage window in wide-eyed wonder, taking in the sprawl of the city with equal parts excitement and nervousness. Crimson banners bearing the crowned stag of King Robert fluttered above the battlements. The wind carried the scent of salt from Blackwater Bay, intermingled with something sharper. Stale sewage and rancid fish, perhaps, but that unpleasantness seemed distant enough at first that it barely registered in her mind. She was a young girl with romantic ideals of knights and stories. The Golden City she had long imagined now laid out before her. Her father, Lord Eddard Stark, was summoned to serve as Hand of the King after the death of Lord Jon Arryn. Sansa overheard tidbits of adult conversation that hinted at foul play or some deeper intrigue surrounding Jon Arryn's passing, but it seemed unthinkable in the moment. To her mind, King's Landing was a place of gracious queens and chivalrous kings, courtly dances and tournaments. She pictured herself on Joffrey's arm. Prince Joffrey, golden-haired and proud, who was to be her betrothed, and the notion made her heart flutter. She paid little heed to the steely cast of her father's eyes or the tension in her mother's voice when they said their goodbyes at Winterfell. They had parted ways too quickly for Sansa's liking. All she could think about was the dream. She would become a queen, or at least live close to a queen, wearing silky gowns and receiving smiles from handsome lords. Yet even then, on that morning they entered the capital, Sansa could not help noticing the chill in the air despite the southern heat. It was not winter's chill. She knew that well enough from the north, but something intangible, a sense that the city could devour the unwary. She thought that only in passing, before her attention was captured by the splendor of the Red Keep, perched on Aegon's high hill like a fortress out of some grand ballad. There, she told herself, she would thrive if only she learned how to conduct herself with grace. Her father had taught her the values of honor, but she also knew that her mother had been raised in the South and understood the significance of courtesy and alliances. Sansa told herself she would be the perfect lady, the perfect consort to Joffrey, and everything would turn out well. Was that not the way in the stories? The court was abuzz with the arrival of the new hand, and Sansa was soon lost in a whirlwind of formal greetings. She, her younger sister Arya, her father, and the household that accompanied them were paraded before King Robert Baratheon and Queen Cersei Lannister. Joffrey stood beside his parents with a bored expression, yet he smiled when Sansa's name was announced, offering her a slight bow that sent heat rushing to her cheeks. His beauty and regal bearing still enchanted her. She could hardly believe this young man would someday be hers. She bobbed a graceful curtsy and tried to ignore the stern way her father looked at King Robert's court. Only moments later did Sansa notice the figure quietly observing from behind the royals. A man of middling height, with a small pointed beard, wearing a confident smirk. Lord Peter Baelish Littlefinger, some called him, watched her in a way that made her feel momentarily self-conscious, as though he were dissecting her every gesture, her every thought. He stepped forward to greet Lord Stark warmly enough, though Sansa caught a subtle flicker in his eyes that suggested something else entirely. Peter Baelish all but ignored her at first, but she noticed the faint nod he gave her father, the sly comment about how she had grown. Eddard Stark's face tightened, and Sansa wondered at the discomfort in his expression. It was only later she would learn the complicated history Peter Baelish had with her mother, Lady Catelyn. As the days in King's Landing passed, Sansa was taken under the wing of Septa Mordane, who continued her instruction in ladylike conduct. She was also whisked away at times by Queen Cersei for small glimpses of court life, to show her how a future queen might move among her subjects. Sansa was dazzled by the garments and jewels, by the grand halls and the labyrinth of corridors. Occasionally she caught a glimpse of Peter Baelish lingering around corners or exchanging hushed words with Lord Varys, the Master of Whisperers. She noticed how he seemed to appear where he was least expected, how servants gave him a wide berth, how he wore a perpetual half-smile that put her on edge. She found him a puzzle, so cordial on the surface, yet with a glint in his eye that suggested he was measuring others for his own advantage. One afternoon, As Sansa was strolling through the gardens near the Red Keep, hoping for a quiet moment to reflect, she encountered Lord Baelish by a marble bench overlooking a fountain. He smiled, quite disarmingly, and beckoned her to join him. Uncertain, she approached with the guarded courtesy she had seen her mother display at times with suspicious lords. Peter Baelish was quick to compliment her, to ask about her day, to make the kind of small talk that lulled Sansa into a polite response. She felt a tension in that moment, something like fear, but also curiosity. Unlike Joffrey, who flaunted his status openly, Peter Baelish seemed almost too congenial, too ready to charm. And yet she found a part of her wanting to be charmed, to glimpse more of the secret workings of the court. He asked her simple questions at first. How did she find the city? Was the climate too warm for her northern blood? Had she enjoyed the last feast? She answered dutifully, her voice a gentle timbre. In truth, she was trying to puzzle out why he would seek her out. He made an offhand remark about how a lady with her upbringing, her sense of courtesy, could find great favor in the capital if she learned to cultivate the right friendships. Sansa, in her naivete, asked him what he meant, and he only chuckled softly. There are many players in this game, my dear Sansa, he said. Some play with swords, some with gold, and some with secrets. The trick is to know which piece to move and when. It was the first time anyone had ever referred to court life as a game to her face, and she felt herself shiver at the implication. She remembered her father's cautions about trusting men like Baelish. Yet at the same time, she was intrigued by the idea of learning more, of stepping beyond the boundaries her father's stern sense of honor had set for her. She pictured herself at Joffrey's side, admired by the entire realm, wearing the crown. Something in Peter Baelish's voice suggested that such a vision could indeed come to pass if she only listened. There was a small voice in Sansa's head warning her that she ought to excuse herself, that she should not tarry too long with a man her father clearly mistrusted. But when Baelish offered a slight bow and expressed admiration for her future prospects, his tone lowered almost conspiratorially. She found herself wanting to hear more. The seeds of their alliance, if one could call it that, were planted in that garden, though they remained hidden beneath layers of politeness. In the following weeks, Joffrey grew more openly callous. Sansa, determined to look upon him as the gallant prince she had always imagined, tried her best to excuse his cold remarks and his moments of casual cruelty, even when they were directed at her sister Arya or the butcher's boy Micah. Sansa clung to her illusions because they were comfortable, and because she had been taught that a lady must keep her composure no matter the provocation. Yet, while she struggled with these disillusionments, Lord Baelish was never far behind, offering subtle comments or a guiding hand. He would appear by her side in a corridor or near a balcony and speak in a gentle, confidential tone. Over time, Sansa found herself confiding small worries to him, worries she did not dare voice to her father, who seemed distracted by his duties as hand. When the tragedy involving Micah occurred, and her direwolf lady was executed by Queen Cersei's order, Sansa was devastated. She felt her innocence slipping away, replaced by the bleak realization that the royal family she had admired could be heartless and cruel. In the aftermath, Ned Stark lectured her quietly, but also sought to comfort her. She felt shame, guilt, and sorrow all at once. Then, at a moment when she was at her lowest, Baelish appeared again, offering a sympathetic ear and a measured word. He refrained from speaking overtly ill of the Lannisters. He was too cunning for that, but he planted doubts in her mind. If a queen could take a life so easily, what might she do to Sansa's family? If Joffrey did not object to the execution of her beloved direwolf, did that not speak volumes of his regard for her? Sansa was torn, wanting desperately to believe that Joffrey was merely misunderstood, that once they were wed, he would be the devoted husband she had dreamed of. She tried to find solace in the notion that he might be frightened of disappointing his mother. The illusions continued to fray, and Littlefinger was there to watch each thread unravel, offering her not comfort exactly, but an alternate vision. If she did not trust the Lannisters, if she sensed the danger, perhaps she needed alliances of her own. The notion was shocking to her, but she felt the city's undercurrents pressing in. Fear, ambition, betrayal, it all swirled around her. She realized she had no idea how to navigate such waters. When news came that King Robert Baratheon was gravely injured from a hunting accident, the tension in the Red Keep became almost suffocating. Sansa could see how her father grew increasingly restless, searching for truths about Joffrey's parentage, about the sudden threat posed by the Lannisters if they seized power. On one particular evening, Sansa was sobbing in her chambers, uncertain if her father would force her to return to Winterfell, terrified about losing the only future she had dreamt of. It was then that Baelish took a bolder step in his approach. He visited her quietly, unannounced, bringing a tray of lemon cakes that he knew she adored. Septa Mordane hesitated at the door, unsure if it was appropriate to allow his presence, but Baelish had a silver tongue. He spoke to Sansa about the coming storm, about her father's grave mistake in confronting Queen Cersei without the proper leverage. He hinted at knowledge of the secret Ned Stark had discovered, Joffrey's illegitimacy. Sansa turned pale, so stunned by the suggestion that her betrothed was not truly the king's son that she could scarcely speak. But Peter's voice was gentle, persuasive, explaining that such truths could be as deadly as a sharpened blade if revealed without caution. He told her that her father's sense of honor was commendable, but that it could also be used against him. If Ned Stark openly accused the Queen, the Lannisters would respond with force. War could ensue. Sansa would be caught in the crossfire or worse, used as a hostage. Panicked, she asked him what could be done. He leaned close, speaking in a hushed tone. She must go to the Queen, he suggested, and caution her that Ned intended to reveal the truth if Robert should die. This would earn Sansa the Queen's favor, protect her from being dismissed. At the same time, Peter would ensure that Ned Stark was not harmed. He implied he had enough influence to keep Ned alive if matters turned dire. Sansa, frightened and desperate, considered his words. She was torn between loyalty to her father and the practicality of saving him from his own rigid sense of justice. Baelish was persuasive, painting the scenario in a light that made Sansa believe she could save her father by warning the Queen, that she might prove her devotion to Joffrey and thus prevent a bloodbath. Her decision to go to Queen Cersei that night sealed the first true bond between Sansa Stark and Peter Baelish. She committed a fateful act, betraying her father's intentions, though in her mind she did so to protect him. The Queen listened to Sansa's halting confession with cold calculation, then told her she was a sweet girl and that everything would be fine so long as she remained loyal. Sansa went to bed troubled, waiting for her father to thank her for her efforts, expecting that he would be spared once King Robert died. But events raced out of her control. Robert died, Cersei moved swiftly, and Ned's attempt to challenge Joffrey's claim ended in the throne room, where swords were drawn, and he was arrested for treason. Sansa watched in horror from across the chamber as her father was seized. She pleaded for his life to the Queen, to Joffrey, tears streaming down her face. Cersei gave her thin-lipped assurances, but Sansa knew from that look that she could not place her hope in the Queen's mercy. Devastated, she turned to Peter Baelish, who caught her eye from behind the line of gold cloaks. That faint half-smile on his face told her all she needed to know. He was on top of the situation, or so he wished her to believe. He gave a slight nod, a signal that he would handle this. Impossibly, Sansa discovered that Baelish had arranged for her to visit her father in his dark cell, under the guise of pity. She knelt beside Ned Stark in tears, explaining how she had tried to protect him by warning the Queen, how Lord Baelish had promised that it would shield him. Ned's expression in that moment was filled with a heartbreak so profound that Sansa's stomach twisted in knots. She realized then that Peter had manipulated her, or at least used her good intentions to maneuver events. Her father, too weak and wounded, simply pressed a hand to her face, telling her that she was not to blame. He asked only that she keep herself safe. Sansa wept, promising she would do anything to spare his life. Ned told her that if she must, she should plead for mercy before the court, to proclaim Joffrey the rightful king, that she might save him from the headsman's sword. But Joffrey, newly crowned, was not interested in mercy. When Ned was dragged before the Great September of Baelor, Sansa pleaded desperately, believing until the last moment that her words might sway him. Instead, Joffrey flaunted his power, overrode the council, and had Ned Stark beheaded. The sight of her father's head on the pike was the moment Sansa Stark's dreams died completely. Something inside her shattered. She knelt on the ground, tears streaming, her mind awash in horror. Joffrey's triumphant sneer burned itself into her memory. That day, she realized that the boy she had adored was a monster, and that the court she had yearned to be part of was a nest of vipers. Yet after that moment of devastation, Sansa felt a cold clarity begin to form. She had lost everything, her father, her illusions. She was alone in the Red Keep, surrounded by Lannisters who treated her like a prisoner rather than a guest. She knew that her sister Arya had vanished. Her mother was in the Riverlands. Robb was in the north raising an army. And she was here, betrothed to the king who had executed her father. It was a cruel twist of fate. Her first impulse was to defy them openly, to scream and curse Joffrey. But then she recalled what that would accomplish. Her father had defied them, and it had cost him his head. Days passed like a grim fog, but from that fog, Peter Baelish emerged once again, quiet and cunning. He came to her after a particularly humiliating court session in which Joffrey forced her to look upon her father's head. She had threatened to push Joffrey off the walkway. The Hound had intervened. Littlefinger found her trembling in her chambers, tear tracks staining her face. He did not speak words of pity. Instead, he told her, "You have lost much, my lady, but you still have your wits. There are ways to avenge your father if you have the patience, the will, and the cunning. I can show you, if you'll trust me." Trust. The word made her recoil. She reminded him that it was his advice that led her to speak to the Queen in the first place, leading to Ned's downfall. Peter's expression shifted slightly, as though he wore a mask. He confessed, quite artfully, that while events did not transpire as he had hoped, he believed Ned might have survived had things gone more smoothly. Joffrey's cruelty was unpredictable. He offered a kind of apology wrapped in a rationalization. Then he spoke of his own ambitions for the Iron Throne, or rather, for power that lay behind it. He told Sansa that if she wanted retribution, if she wished to someday see Joffrey suffer for what he had done, she would need powerful allies and a plan that was not clouded by sentiment. She would need to learn how to play the game. In her despair and anger, Sansa found herself listening, the words taking root in her. She wanted to believe there was a path that could lead her to see Joffrey undone, to see the Lannisters punished. She asked Baelish why he would help her, and he offered that mocking half-smile. He spoke of debts owed to House Tully, of his once deep affection for her mother, of his admiration for Sansa's resilience. Perhaps a kernel of truth lay in each of these reasons, but Sansa also sensed that Baelish simply saw in her a valuable piece on the board. She did not care in that moment, for her hatred of Joffrey was growing with each passing day, and she had no illusions left about honor saving her. So she made a fateful choice. She would accept Peter Baelish's tutelage. She would remain outwardly compliant, sweet, demure, while behind the scenes, she would scheme. In the months that followed, the War of the Five Kings exploded across Westeros, and King's Landing became a hotbed of intrigue. The city was rife with rumors. Robb Stark winning victories in the field, Renly Baratheon declaring himself king, Stannis marching with acclaim. All the while, Sansa feigned loyalty to Joffrey. She kept her head bowed, endured his humiliations, and bided her time. She insisted to him that she was his loyal subject, her voice dripping with feigned devotion. She praised his strength, swallowed every insult he threw her way, and yearned to see him brought low. Peter Baelish observed her progress. He was impressed by how well she could mask her hatred. He was careful in tutoring her, rarely speaking conspiracies aloud, but hinting at ways she could sow discord in the Red Keep. One day, Sansa found herself passing along a subtle rumor to a court lady, who passed it along to another, until it reached Cersei's ears, causing friction between the Queen and her brother Tyrion. Another time, Sansa managed to compliment Margaery Tyrell, Renly's newly declared queen, when the Tyrells arrived in the capital after Renly's death. In doing so, She planted a seed of friendship that might be exploited later. The changes were small, imperceptible to those who viewed Sansa as merely a frightened girl. But Baelish saw the difference. He found her progress remarkable. During the Battle of the Blackwater, when Stannis attacked the city, Sansa was sequestered with Cersei and the other noble ladies in Maegor's Holdfast. She listened to the queen's bitter musings, the talk of how the city might be sacked, of how they would all be ravaged and slain. Sansa clutched a shard of fear in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. She remembered Baelish's voice telling her that fear could be a weapon. If one did not show it, they could provoke it in others. So she maintained a serene facade, even as the bells tolled and the flames lit the waters of the Blackwater Bay. She offered a prayer for the men fighting outside, but deep down, she also prayed that the Lannisters would suffer a ruinous defeat. Yet it was not to be. Tyrion's cunning, combined with Tywin's timely arrival with the Tyrells, repelled Stannis. The city was saved. Sansa's illusions of an immediate downfall for the Lannisters vanished. After the battle, Joffrey announced he would marry Margaery Tyrell, casting Sansa aside. Publicly, Sansa pretended to be devastated, but inside, she felt relief. She was free of that monstrous betrothal. But freedom was fleeting in King's Landing. The Tyrells were now allied with the Lannisters, which meant Sansa's position remained precarious. She was a political pawn, the daughter of a traitor in the eyes of the crown. Yet Baelish assured her that events were moving in a direction that could benefit them, if they were patient. He confided that he had gained the favor of the new royal alliance by brokering the match between the Tyrells and the Lannisters. As a reward, he was to be made Lord of Harrenhal and be given the task of wooing Lysa Arryn in the Vale, consolidating power there in the name of the Iron Throne. Sansa recognized that Baelish's star was rising. He told her that she must remain in the capital for now, because he needed eyes and ears, and also because it would be too suspicious if she vanished with him. However, he promised that soon enough, she would have an opportunity to escape the Lannisters' clutches. And once she did, she could join him, and they would begin orchestrating a new order in the realm, one that would see her avenged. Sansa found this promise both intoxicating and terrifying. She knew to trust Baelish only so far as their goals aligned, but if he could truly lift her from her nightmare, if he could help her seize not just her freedom but a measure of power, the thought was too tempting to dismiss. She resolved to continue playing her part, quietly waiting for the right opportunity, all the while feeding Peter what information she could glean from the Lannisters and the Tyrells. Her quiet presence in the castle was rarely remarked upon. The Lannisters seemed to think of her as a docile relic, a prisoner who could be paraded out when convenient. Yet in hidden corners of the keep, she learned secrets. About Cersei's tensions with Margaery, about Tyrion's conflicts with his sister, about the uneasy truce between Tywin and the Tyrells. Each secret she whispered to Baelish in a coded form, or in quick snatches of conversation when no one was looking. Her alliance with Littlefinger solidified after she uncovered a small but crucial piece of information. The Tyrells were covertly plotting to expedite Joffrey's demise, though she did not yet understand the full scope of the plan involving the infamous Purple Wedding. She only knew from overhearing Margaery's ladies that Olenna Tyrell despised Joffrey and wanted her granddaughter to marry Tommen instead. Sansa suspected that some dire event would be arranged to remove Joffrey as an obstacle. She shared her suspicions with Baelish, who merely smiled in that knowing way, telling her that if such a thing came to pass, they must be ready to act. When the day of Joffrey and Margaery's wedding arrived, the capital was in full celebration. Sansa moved through the festivities like a shadow, forcing a polite smile whenever Joffrey's gaze fell upon her. She noticed Olenna Tyrell adjusting her hairnet, which contained the strangler poison. She sensed the tension in the air, yet did not intervene. She felt no remorse in letting Joffrey's doom unfold. In truth, she felt a sick anticipation. And when Joffrey began to choke on the wine and collapsed, turning purple, Sansa felt horror warring with a twisted sense of justice. The boy king who had beheaded her father was dying before her eyes. A part of her wanted to exult. She suppressed the emotion, wearing a mask of shock, kneeling beside the fallen king just as all the courtiers did. Cersei's screams echoed through the feast hall, the king's guards scrambling in confusion. Sansa slipped out in the chaos, aided by Ser Dantos at Baelish's instruction. She hurried away, her heart pounding, her mind spinning. She knew that if she stayed, she would be blamed. She was still legally betrothed to Joffrey until he had cast her aside publicly, and she was a Stark, forever labeled a traitor's daughter. She had to flee. Ser Dantos led her to a waiting ship in the bay. Once aboard, she encountered Petyr Baelish again, who greeted her with a mocking bow, a sly grin on his lips. He revealed that he had orchestrated her rescue, that the Tyrells had inadvertently done the dirty work for them by poisoning Joffrey. Now the time had come to position Sansa in a place where she could truly shape her own fate. She traveled with Baelish to the Vale, to the Eyrie, where her Aunt Lysa Arryn greeted her with initial warmth that swiftly turned to paranoia and jealousy. Sansa was forced to navigate her aunt's volatile emotions. Lysa's obsession with Petyr was plain, and Sansa could see how Baelish manipulated the older woman's affections to maintain control. For Sansa, it was another lesson in the dark arts of power. She watched how Baelish used a gentle tone, a false promise of love, a few carefully chosen phrases to placate Lysa, to keep her from turning on them both. Yet the situation was precarious. Lysa's mental stability wavered. In a moment of madness, she tried to hurl Sansa through the moon door, accusing her of trying to steal Petyr's love. That was when Baelish revealed the full extent of his ruthlessness, shoving Lysa out the door instead, sending her plunging to her death. Sansa stood transfixed, the wind from the mountain whipping her hair, her heart pounding as she watched Lysa's body vanish into the abyss. She felt a stab of horror, yet also a realization. Baelish had committed murder for them both to survive. He was every bit as dangerous as the Lannisters, perhaps more so. But in that moment, he was her one ally, the only person who saw her not as a pawn but as a partner of sorts. He had risked his position by killing Lysa so openly, but he assured Sansa they would craft a story to secure the Vale's loyalty. In the eyes of the Vale Lords, Lysa's death would be an unfortunate accident or, better yet, a suicide prompted by her unstable mind. Sansa backed him with a calm composure that surprised even herself, weaving half-truths into a narrative that exonerated them. Lord Baelish used his silver tongue to persuade the Vale Lords of his innocence, and they accepted Sansa's testimony. Thus began a new phase of Sansa's life in the Vale, under the protection and tutelage of Petyr Baelish. She adopted the disguise of Elaine Stone in public, passing as Baelish's natural daughter. But behind closed doors, the two plotted. Petyr's ambition was vast. He told Sansa that the Vale was a strong position from which to exert power over the Seven Kingdoms. Its knights were fresh, unbloodied by the war. If they could secure the Vale's loyalty, they could play kingmaker in the ongoing conflicts between the Lannisters, the Tyrells, the Baratheon claimants, and even the newly emerging threat of House Targaryen across the sea. However, in this alternate course of events, Sansa's hatred for the Lannisters burned bright. She had not forgotten her vow to destroy the family that took her father from her. And with Joffrey dead, she sought a new aim: to see the Lannisters undone, to see the Iron Throne pass into the hands of someone more pliable to her cause, or perhaps even to claim it herself, if that were possible. In the months that followed, Sansa grew more comfortable wielding intrigue as a weapon. She played the role of Elaine Stone adeptly, winning over the Lords of the Vale with her sweet demeanor and her familiarity with their old traditions. Baelish arranged for small gatherings where Sansa could charm Lord Royce, the Belmores, the Corbrays, and others, gradually binding them to their cause. She learned to flatter without being obvious, to glean secrets from half-spoken words. She forged a gentle friendship with the young Robert Arryn, helping to soothe his fits, making him dote on her presence. Littlefinger watched, pleased, as Sansa stepped more fully into the role of a strategist. Once, as they stood on a balcony overlooking the Vale, Petyr murmured that she was blossoming into a rose every bit as potent as Margaery Tyrell, but with sharper thorns honed by northern adversity. The compliment both flattered and chilled her. Meanwhile, the realm tore itself apart further. Tywin Lannister was dead, murdered by Tyrion's hand. Cersei was regent for Tommen, but her own paranoia and miscalculations created unrest. The Tyrells jockeyed for influence. The north was plagued by Ironborn raiders and the Boltons' treachery. Dorne simmered with anger over Prince Oberyn's death. Peter and Sansa observed it all from the Vale, sending out carefully worded letters, forging connections with discontented lords in the Riverlands and the Reach. Sansa learned how to read the tides of political fortune, guided by Baelish's commentary. She discovered that it was not enough to rely on the Vale alone. They needed alliances if they hoped to claim King's Landing. Thus, they hatched a plan to approach certain houses with hidden grievances against the Lannisters. The first step was to unify the Vale behind Lord Robert Arryn, under Peter's regency. Then, using the Vale's army, they would march to the Riverlands, offering to support any local lords who might be loyal to the memory of House Tully. Sansa's mother was a Tully, after all, and though Lady Catelyn was dead, that bloodline connection could be used to inspire loyalty. Peter would position himself as a caretaker of Sansa's rights to the Riverlands, promising to restore the Tully influence. At the same time, covert messages were sent to the Tyrells, hinting that if they grew weary of Cersei's incompetent regency, the Vale might support Margaery's claim through Tommen, if certain conditions were met. It was all a balancing act, a game of shifting alliances where each promise was made only to be renegotiated later. Sansa, for her part, began to speak with a surer voice in these private councils. She reminded Peter that they must also consider the North. If she revealed her true identity to the Northern Bannermen, if she appeared in the name of House Stark, they might rally to her. But Baelish cautioned her that the North was far away, embroiled in its own troubles, and that the Boltons had claimed dominion over Winterfell by twisted royal decree. They would need a show of force before they could challenge the Boltons. So they agreed to bide their time, focusing first on King's Landing. Once the capital was under their influence or control, it would be far easier to remove the Boltons from Winterfell. A key turning point arrived when Cersei's hold on power weakened drastically after her arrest by the Faith Militant. News reached the Vale that the Queen Regent was imprisoned and forced to atone in a most humiliating manner. Tommen was left floundering, with Kevan Lannister attempting to restore stability. Meanwhile, the Tyrells fumed that their queen, Margaery, had also been arrested on charges of perjury and impropriety. The city was in disarray. Peter Baelish saw the perfect opportunity to march on King's Landing under the pretext of restoring order. He went before the Vale Lords with a rousing speech, emphasizing that a boy king was being manipulated by corrupt influences, that the realm needed the guiding hand of honorable men like themselves to secure peace. Sansa, standing beside Peter, played the role of a concerned maiden, speaking softly about how the realm suffered, how the North had been betrayed, how the Vale could set matters right. Galvanized by Baelish's persuasion, and charmed by Sansa Stark's gentle pleas, the Vale Lords agreed to muster their forces. They marched south, gathering smaller Riverlands houses along the way. The scattered Freys were mistrusted by many. The Tully seat of Riverrun was besieged, but under Baelish's cunning, the siege was temporarily lifted with promises to the Freys that the crown, once stabilized, would reward them further. The Freys, never truly trusting anyone, demanded guarantees, but Baelish knew how to spin illusions. He teased them with talk of further titles, taxes, and even possible marriages to cement alliances. All the while, Sansa quietly appealed to the older generation's sense of guilt for the Red Wedding, implying that the Freys' position was precarious should the tide turn fully against them. By the time the Vale army reached the outskirts of King's Landing, the city was in chaos. The Faith Militant roamed the streets, Tommen was paralyzed by indecision, Kevan Lannister was struggling to maintain order, and Margaery was still in the hands of the High Sparrow. Peter Baelish approached Kevan Lannister as a supposed ally, offering to bring the Vale forces into the city to restore peace and uphold Tommen's reign. Desperate for help and pressed on all sides, Kevan allowed the Vale host to enter the capital. The city gates opened, and thousands of knights and men-at-arms marched through the cobbled streets, their banners bearing the falcon of House Arryn. The small folk looked on, uncertain whether this was salvation or conquest. What followed was a swift coup that moved with the deadly grace of a serpent. While outwardly professing loyalty to Tommen, Peter Baelish maneuvered to have Kevan Lannister isolated. Under the cloak of night, hidden mercenaries in Baelish's employ murdered Kevin, leaving Tommen effectively leaderless. The faith militant, suspicious of any power shift, attempted to assert control, but the Vale Knights crushed the poorly armed Sparrows in a series of brutal street clashes. The High Sparrow himself was detained and cast into a dungeon. Baelish had no sympathy for religious zealots who would challenge his authority. In the Red Keep, Tommen remained a frightened boy, desperately clinging to Ser Jaime Lannister as his protector. But Jaime's political power was limited. He had only a fraction of the Kingsguard at his disposal, and the City Watch was quickly turning to Baelish's side as they saw the writing on the wall. Sansa, wearing a modest gown of deep blue trimmed with fur, a subtle nod to her northern heritage, came before Tommen in his throne room. She knelt in a show of respect, flanked by Vale Knights and a smirking Peter Baelish. Tommen, bewildered, asked Sansa what she wanted. She spoke softly but firmly. She wanted justice for her father, justice for the North, and a kingdom that was not torn apart by the Lannisters' lies and manipulations. She told Tommen that if he wished to remain on the throne, he must set Margaery free, dissolve the faith militant, and accept the Vale's regency until he came of age. The boy king trembled, unsure of himself. Jaime Lannister bristled, but he was outnumbered, outmaneuvered. In that moment, Peter Baelish stepped forward, offering Tommen a quill and parchment. He suggested that, for his own safety and the good of the realm, Tommen sign a royal decree granting Baelish the formal title of Lord Protector, with Sansa Stark as his ward and royal advisor. Intimidated by the ring of armed men, Tommen complied. The court around them was stunned into silence. Cersei was absent, still under house arrest after her humiliating walk of atonement. She could do nothing to prevent the coup. In one deft move, Baelish and Sansa had seized control of King's Landing. Soon, they released Margaery from the Great September, forging a fragile alliance with the Tyrells. Margaery, furious and humiliated by the faith, found herself with few options. She was reunited with Tommen, but the boy king now lived under the watchful eyes of the Vale Knights. Margaery, no stranger to political maneuvering, recognized that Baelish and Sansa were the new powers in the city, but she also saw potential in forging a bond with Sansa, if only to keep her husband safe and maintain some measure of influence. What began as an uneasy partnership gradually crystallized into a new ruling council. Baelish was Lord Protector, controlling the Gold Cloaks and the City Watch. Sansa Stark held sway over the hearts of the small folk, who remembered her father's honor and pitted her tragic story. Margaery, deeply resentful of her captivity by the faith, worked to restore the Tyrell name in the capital, distributing food and resources to the poor, maintaining her image as the beloved queen. Tommen remained on the throne, a figurehead of sorts, though at times Sansa would comfort him, speaking in gentle tones, reminding him that she did not wish him harm, only that he not stand in the way of her vengeance. The boy seemed relieved to have someone motherly near him, even if that comfort was tinged with fear. In public ceremonies, Baelish and Sansa stood by Tommen's side, proclaiming their dedication to the crown. Yet behind the scenes, they pulled the strings. Peter installed new officials loyal to him in key positions: Master of Coin, Master of Laws, and so on. Sansa personally oversaw the reorganization of the Red Keep's household, ensuring that many of the Queen Mother's attendants were replaced by those who would remain loyal to the new regime. Ser Bronn of the Blackwater, now a lord, was coaxed into supporting Baelish with promises of gold and more lands. The small council became a reflection of Baelish's ambition, with Sansa's voice carrying more weight than any would have imagined back when she was just a frightened northern girl. Amid all these changes, the question of Cersei Lannister remained. She was a lioness locked in a gilded cage, furious and humiliated, despised by the faith and overshadowed by Baelish's ascendancy. Some expected that she would be executed for her crimes, but Peter reasoned that keeping her alive might be more useful. She was, after all, the king's mother. Her existence kept Tommen in line to some extent, though the boy's loyalty had shifted in the face of fear. Sansa, for her part, visited Cersei once in her confined chambers, accompanied by guards. The moment was charged. Cersei glared at her with undisguised loathing, accusing Sansa of orchestrating Joffrey's murder and now usurping her family's rightful power. Sansa stared back, recalling the day her father was killed on Cersei's orders. She did not deny anything. Instead, she spoke in a steady voice, telling Cersei that the realm needed a new beginning, that the old ways of Lannister dominance were over. She took a slow breath, then added a quiet whisper. "You wanted me to be silent and obedient forever, but you made me what I am today." The memory of Ned's final moments gave Sansa a fierceness she had never felt before. Cersei's voice caught in her throat, and for the first time, Sansa saw a flicker of fear in the lioness' eyes. Soon after, Baelish consolidated control over the city. The cheering in the streets for the Vale Knights was tepid at first, but with careful distribution of grain and the restoration of order, the small folk began to accept the new reality. The High Sparrow's body was displayed outside the Great September, a grim reminder that the crown would not tolerate sedition. Margaery Tyrell set about rehabilitating her image, appearing with Tommen in public squares, playing the dutiful queen once more. Sansa, however, was no longer content to remain a background figure. She joined the charitable outings, ensuring that the northern perspective was represented. She spoke of justice, of forging a realm untainted by the cruelties that had claimed so many lives. In subtle ways, she worked to diminish the Lannister name, quietly encouraging certain minstrel ballads that portrayed House Lannister as corrupt and House Stark as honorable. Propaganda, Peter called it with a sly grin, but Sansa recognized the power of stories. She had once been enthralled by them herself. Then came the pressing question of the Boltons in the north. Word reached King's Landing of the atrocities committed by Ramsay Bolton at Winterfell, of how the Northern Lords hated the Bolton usurpers. Jon Snow had been named Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, rumored to be dealing with wildlings and the threats beyond the Wall. Sansa yearned to see Winterfell reclaimed, to see her home free from the grip of traitors. Peter, for once, seemed cautious. He reminded her that the North was vast, that an army would need to be mustered, and that their hold on King's Landing was still delicate. But Sansa pressed him, reminding him that if they truly wished to rule the Seven Kingdoms, they could not leave the North in chaos. Their best move, Sansa suggested, was to proclaim her as Wardeness of the North by royal decree. Tommen could issue it. Then the Vale Knights, along with the northern houses still loyal to House Stark, could unite to oust the Boltons. She would be established as the rightful ruler in Winterfell. Baelish considered the proposal, steepling his fingers, measuring Sansa's passion. He understood that placing her in Winterfell would grant him an even broader reach. If House Stark was re-established under his influence, he would have the North and the Vale under his thumb, in addition to his power in the capital. Yet he also recognized the risk. Sansa's first loyalty might be to her family's seat, not to him. And if she married a powerful northern lord, she might become uncontrollable. But he also could not deny that her star was rising. She had proven herself not just a pawn but a capable player. To keep her loyal, he would need to give her what she desired. So he agreed on the condition that the campaign be planned meticulously. They would need to gather the support of lords who despised the Boltons and wanted a Stark on the throne of the North. Thus, the royal decree was issued in Tommen's name, proclaiming that Sansa Stark was absolved of all accusations of treason against the crown, and that she was to be recognized as the rightful heir of Winterfell and Wardeness of the North in her own right until such time as a suitable match was found for her. Sansa read the parchment with a mixture of triumph and anxiety. She could practically hear the uproar it would cause in the North, especially among those sworn to the Boltons. But the legitimate Northern Lords would welcome the chance to rally behind a Stark. Peter Baelish's knights would march north soon, joined by a fraction of the crown's forces under the command of men now loyal to him. Margaery Tyrell, for her part, seemed content to remain in King's Landing, focusing on her position as queen to Tommen, ensuring the Tyrells retained influence in the capital while Baelish and Sansa extended their reach to the north. On the eve of Sansa's departure, Peter met her in the Godswood of the Red Keep, a pale imitation of Winterfell's ancient Godswood, with no heart tree, just a small garden dotted with foreign trees. The air was still and thick with the hush of night. Sansa stood there, gazing at the sky. When Baelish approached, She did not turn at first. She felt his presence, the swirl of tension that always accompanied him. Part of her was grateful for all he had taught her, for the power he had helped her seize. Another part was wary, fearing that she was but another step in his grand plan. She had grown skilled enough to keep those feelings from showing on her face. "You leave for Winterfell soon," Baelish said, his voice warm. "Soon. The wolves will howl again in the north." She nodded. "They will. But not before we see the Bolton flayed." She spoke with a calm certainty. "I won't rest until they're driven out, until the memory of them is a curse in every northern hall." Peter chuckled. "I've no doubt you'll see it done. When next we meet, you will be Lady of Winterfell or Wardness, as Tommen has decreed." Sansa turned then, meeting his gray-green eyes. "This has always been your goal, hasn't it? To rule the realm through alliances, to hold both the north and the capital in your hands." His smile was faint. "I am but a humble servant of the crown, my lady, and I've always wanted to protect you." She studied him a long moment. She knew his words carried a double edge. "I remember when you told me everything was a game. I was too naive to understand. But you were right. We're all players." "Yes," he agreed softly, "but some play better than others." Without another word, she inclined her head and walked away, leaving him by the pool of the godswood. She wondered if, in the end, she would turn on him as he had turned on so many. But that was a worry for another day. For now, they were allies, bound by mutual ambition and vengeance. She would secure the north. He would maintain King's Landing. Together, they would shape the realm in their image, or so he believed. And so the next chapter of Sansa Stark's life began. A long, measured march north with banners bearing the Falcon of the Vale and the dire wolf of House Stark, newly stitched by Sansa's own hand. She remembered her father's face under the watchful eyes of the Red Keep. She remembered Joffrey's sneer. She remembered the bruises on her soul. And she remembered Peter's lessons, the cunning she had honed to survive. As the column of soldiers stretched out across the King's Road, she rode at the head, her back straight, her eyes focused on some distant horizon where Winterfell waited, battered but unbroken. King's Landing had not destroyed her. Instead, it had transformed her. She might not hold a sword, but she held the hearts of men, through empathy, through manipulation, through the carefully woven tapestry of her identity as both victim and victor. She was no longer the little bird caged in the Red Keep. She was a wolf, cloaked in courtesy, but no less dangerous for it. Peter Baelish had seen that potential from the start and nurtured it for his own ends. But the future was uncertain. Wolves, once unchained, could be unpredictable. Even the cunning master of coin could not control all the variables forever. For now, though, their alliance stood. Sansa Stark had seized King's Landing, in her own quiet, ruthless way, by aligning with the man who played the game better than most. In a land ravaged by war, with dragons rumored across the sea, and the dead whispered to be rising in the far north, her story was far from over. But she had taken her destiny into her own hands. Should the day come when she faced the final confrontation with all the kingdom's powers, she would not be a frightened girl pleading for mercy. She would be the Lady of Winterfell, the orchestrator of fate, and the keeper of her family's legacy. As the Vale army vanished into the dust of the road, King's Landing entered a new era under Baelish's regency. In hidden taverns and bustling markets, the small folk whispered tales of the Northern Maiden who had lost her father to the Lannisters and returned with the Knights of the Vale to bring order. Some spoke of her with sympathy, others with awe, and a few with fear. In the Red Keep's corridors, the courtiers who once sneered at Sansa Stark walked carefully now, eyes lowered, tongues guarded. They sensed the shift in power. They could not yet know how this Game of Thrones would end, only that the seemingly gentle girl from the north had learned how to play, and she played to win. Only time would reveal what deeper designs Peter Baelish harbored, and whether Sansa would eventually break free of his influence or surpass him. For now, the Iron Throne belonged to a boy king, the city to Baelish, and the hearts of many to the Stark Maiden who had become something far more formidable. Winter was coming, as it always did, But this time it brought with it a sense of retribution and the promise of a realm reshaped by quiet cunning and unwavering resolve. And if King's Landing's red walls had devoured many, perhaps they had finally met their match in the woman they had forged out of betrayal, heartbreak, and the slow burn of revenge.